Hello and welcome to Women's Health Explained by Screen Me. I'm your host Jess, and along with a range of wonderful expert guests, I'll be walking you through what you need to know about your own health. We will cover hot topics including hormonal balance, fertility, PCOS, gut health and so much more. So keep listening and I hope that you enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to Fertility Matters with UK Health Radio and Screen Me. And I have with me today the wonderful Sharon Mustard. So she's a psychotherapist at Mustard Therapy and the coaching founder and director at Easy Birthing Fertility to Parenthood. I'm Jess, your host, and we'll be talking today a little bit about the topic of tokophobia, which Sharon obviously knows a lot about. And yeah, she's been a wonderful guest already. So really excited to have this chat with her. So yeah, welcome, Sharon.
Thank you. I'm very excited as well. It's lovely to be back.
Oh, lovely to have you. So I guess just to kind of fill in listeners that maybe don't know what tokophobia is, and yeah, just maybe a little bit about tokophobia itself would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a term that, although it's been around for about 15 years now, no, longer, 20 years now, it's something that's relatively new. So a lot of women may not have heard of it. But if we think of a fear of childbirth, and if we think of it on a continuum, tokophobia is the extreme fear, or sometimes we call it the pathological fear of childbirth. So that is where a woman is so fearful of childbirth or pregnancy that a number of things can happen that can severely affect her daily functioning. But I'm sure we'll get into that in time. One thing to say also to your listeners that sometimes you might see it spelt with a K or a C. So T-O-C-O or T-O-K-O. It's the same thing, because lots of people say, oh, what's the difference between this and this? There aren't any difference. And also sometimes you may hear it pronounced as tokophobia or tokophobia, usually depending on which country you're in. So again, they're the same thing if you do come across both of those.
Yeah, wonderful. So you kind of touched on it a little bit there. So it's not the same as a fear of childbirth. So how do you kind of, distinguish between?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Okay. So like I say, although it is a fear of childbirth, it's an extreme fear of childbirth. Okay. So with people who are tokophobic, it may actually affect, for example, their ability to become pregnant. Because their body has just gone into shutdown because of the extent of the fear. So it's about the intensity and the extreme nature, if you like.
Okay. And so how do you kind of diagnose it as severe? So what are the symptoms? How can it manifest itself in being recognized as this extreme fear?
Yeah. It's often sadly belittled or missed by the medical profession. I think there's a lot more seriousness taking now about the importance of diagnosis. But I think we're still in the very early days of really being able to recognize that. So a woman who is tokophobic, rather than having some fear of childbirth, and I don't want to belittle that either, but a woman who's tokophobic may well be having very obsessive, intrusive thoughts, possibly even all the time about childbirth. And this, by the way, is more common in women who aren't pregnant. Okay.
Oh, wow.
It's very common in women who are pregnant, but it's even more common in women who aren't pregnant. So we're not just including people who are pregnant here. So they may well be having difficulty concentrating just on everyday tasks and concentrating on work, etc., because the intrusive nature of their fear are taking them away all the time. Sometimes it can be... Sorry, Jess, you're going to...
No.
Yeah, I was going to say, sometimes it can actually be accompanied by what we would normally think of as post-traumatic stress symptoms. So things like flashbacks, nightmares, so really the fear is intruding in everything, including our sleep.
Wow, that's no, super interesting, but also super sad. So how common really is this tokophobia? As you say, it's not always or most commonly not even with pregnant women. So how many people are affected by it? And also I guess not just women, but can men have this as well?
They absolutely can. And thank you for raising. So if I say, first of all, about men, there are two, to complicate it further, there are two classifications of tokophobia. One is known as primary tokophobia and one secondary tokophobia. The easiest way to distinguish between the two of those are that primary tokophobia is in a woman, or technically a man, but I'll come back to that in a moment, who has never had a child before, whereas secondary tokophobia is with a woman or man who has been involved in a childbirth experience in the past. Secondary tokophobia, no surprise really, is much, much, much more common for men to suffer rather than primary tokophobia. So normally they haven't quite thought through all of that in the beginning. So secondary tokophobia, if they've already had an experience of birth, that's much, much, much more common for men to actually suffer.
Yeah, sorry. So forgive me if I'm wrong. So does that mean you have to have some kind of experience with being involved in the childbirth process, either as a man or as a woman, to be diagnosed with or to be classified as having tokophobia? I'm just thinking in the context of, say, men or women that haven't had children but yet fear it. Are they still able to be classified as tokophobic?
Definitely, but they would be primary tokophobic because it's not related to a previous birth experience or birth experiences. So you are absolutely right. But like I say, with men, it's much more common for them to be diagnosed with secondary tokophobia. We actually believe, certainly in our practice, and that's across the profession, that it's a lot more common in men and actually a lot more common in women than we're realizing. And I think sometimes men are only going to be picked up if they have had a birth experience before. So we believe that there are a lot more men that aren't being picked up that are primary tokophobic, because who's asking a man either with their partner pregnant for the first time, or with their partner actually wanting to conceive, or they're starting to have those initial discussions about having children. Men don't seem to say, actually, I'm very afraid. And part of that is just society needs to be talking about it more and allowing it to become a lot more, socially acceptable, really.
Yeah, definitely. I think mental health, and particularly male mental health, being discussed a lot more is so important. And I guess also back to the numbers, I believe I read somewhere or something like 1 in 10 men and 1 in 10 women. Are those, do you think, accurate representations? Where are those kind of facts and figures taken from? What's your kind of experience with numbers in that? Just to get
absolutely. So in women who are pregnant, the official figures say 20%. So that would be 1 in 5.
Wow.
Yeah. So even greater than the 1 in 10 that you've read about. It's difficult because we can only ever include in those figures people who are coming forward, women who are coming forward, men who are coming forward, which, as we say, is even less likely to happen, sadly. So in women who are pregnant, the figures certainly show 1 in 5 or 20%. In women who are not pregnant or have never been pregnant, 13% is where we're looking. So even that is greater than 1 in 10.
Wow, that's I didn't realize it was such a widespread issue. And I guess later I'd love to speak about how people can kind of come to terms with this and start to overcome or try to overcome it. But
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
kind of going backwards, what are the causes of this tokophobia, do you think? Or how do you...
Sure, absolutely. So when we're working as therapists with someone who's tokophobic, if we start with secondary tokophobia, because I think the picture there tends to be a little bit clearer and a little bit more narrow as to where we're focusing on the cause of the origins there. Because secondary tokophobic, if you remember, is about someone having been involved in a previous childbirth experience. And so the likely origin is within that experience themselves. Now, a lot of people say, that means they had a traumatic birth experience. Not necessarily. Because if you think trauma, and trauma is about our reaction, not actually about what happened, it's our reaction to what happened. So of course they're linked, but it's about our reaction. And so if a really kind of simple way to define that is if our perceived ability to cope is less than the perceived threat, then if you imagine a woman, even in an obstetrically so-called normal birth experience where there haven't been any particular issues, not anything that has been threatening for her, the baby in any way, she may still, because of her perceived threat, be very fearful in future, or traumatized or tokophobic. Yeah. So usually the origin is in how she felt within that, but some of that may have been, again, even if it was obstetrically normal, a secondary tokophobe, and that really is a term. Very often it can be about feeling that they weren't involved in decision making, feeling that they were helpless, and it was the medical professionals that were orchestrating everything that happened, to the point that they didn't feel involved at all. Some people can actually have dissociated experiences from their body, and kind of not feeling that they're part of that experience. So certainly the causes with secondary tokophobia is usually something around the birth experience itself.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess with the primary tokophobia, what kind of influence do you think that perhaps social media and even just hearing stories from around, I know there can sometimes be a really strong discourse around pregnancy, particularly, really strong stories, and which can sometimes be a bit harsh, and with social media and etc. Do you think that's having a large impact?
You are absolutely right, Jess. So if someone comes along to our clinic, pregnant or not, and they are primary tokophobic, so they haven't had a previous birth experience, we will be looking a lot wider at the potential origins there. Social media and the portrayal of birth in the media is really something we need to get an awful lot better about. There's a lot of fear mongering out there. Of course, people are more likely to tell if they're dissatisfied for an experience. It's part of their kind of catharsis, their processing. But so personal stories, if you like, can be quite biased towards the negative for that reason. You know, you don't find many people going, oh, by the way, my experience of birth or something else was absolutely fine, because they're not motivated to talk about that in the same way. Yeah. The other thing we know is, and again, kind of related to media in a way, is kind of videos shown at secondary school. You'd be surprised or maybe you wouldn't, just how many people can trace their origins back to then, or so-called vicarious learning. So in other words, listening to other people and their portrayal of birth, or even talking about their experiences. And of course, the Chinese whisper idea that always gets that little bit more difficult, that little bit more kind of life-threatening with every telling. So that might be overhearing even as a young child, mothers or as in their mother or aunts or friends or whatever. So just overhearing stuff that their brain isn't mature enough to hold on to at that point.
Yeah, definitely. I think definitely with regards to the education in schools, I can only speak from personal experience, but there's such limited education surrounding pregnancy for both men and women. And so I think, is that something that you think, yeah, that should change, or what kind of things would you kind of put into place to make sure that people are educated on it as a whole?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, and I totally agree with you, Jess, there definitely needs to be a lot more of it, a lot more in depth. And yes, it's got to be age appropriate and kind of layered throughout the years of their school education. But it would make a massive start to stop kind of showing the videos that are quite horrifying. Almost like they're a form of birth control in itself, you do wonder when, there are so many. I mean, if you look at our YouTube channel, for example, there are hundreds of birth videos on there, and if you picked any one of them, they would be less fear-mongering, shall we say, than I guarantee anything that they show in schools. Yeah.
Because what do you think is the difference then? Because obviously it's so important to show the actual birthing process. So you're saying you have hundreds on your own channel. So what is the kind of difference between what you're putting out and what schools are putting out, would you say?
Yeah, I think sometimes schools put out quite highly medicalized videos. And although it's important, we don't want to show women that it's all about being in a darkened room with their eyes closed and, the baby just kind of arrives without major event. But we, for example, a lot of our videos show complications, sometimes major complications. But they show them being resolved. They show maternity teams actually working with the women or the couple. They show empowerment. They show being involved. And that actually is the vast majority of the experience of men and women during birth. It's not the exception. It's not the minority. So we're not cherry picking, if you like. We do show stuff that becomes medicalized. We have courses for women who are having elective C-sections, so we're not saying it all has to be calm, confident and in control. What we want women to do is to be able to adjust to different types of experiences. So our videos would reflect that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's so important to get that range as opposed to either having just the really negative, which unfortunately just does get a lot more clicks through social media, or just making it all through rose tinted glasses. I think it's very good, as you say, to have that kind of range of just really the realistics of what goes on.
Exactly.
Which is a lot better. But I guess from a more personal point, if someone feels as if they have tokophobia or something similar, when and why should they seek help for this, and how do they go about doing this? Is this case of, what steps would you kind of take?
Sure. Well, if they feel, even if they're not aware of that term, or they don't know how severe their fear is, if their fear is disabling, that is the time to seek help. Okay. So you can approach someone like me, you can approach a psychotherapist. That could be on a private service, or if you're accessing NHS services, it would be going via your GP. And they can certainly, it differs between areas and there can be quite long waiting lists, but they can certainly put you in touch with someone who can help at that point. Whether you're pregnant or not, I would say if you're not pregnant and you're either planning to, or you're not quite sure if you ever want to, but your fear is disabling, that is the time to actually seek help. Don't wait until you're pregnant, because we're into timescales there, but also it is much easier to treat tokophobia when someone isn't pregnant. Having said that, most people do come to us when they're pregnant because clearly the motivation is higher. But if you're not pregnant, you do need to actually address this with someone, because it could be seriously affecting your choices. It could be seriously restricting your life decisions, not just about whether to have children or not, but also we know that a lot of women can actually avoid relationships with men who want to have children, or, so it's almost like they're picking criteria as to who they will even have a relationship with.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's so important, especially for listeners that may not be aware of what tokophobia is. I think some of the ways in which it can affect your life, I'd love for you to maybe elaborate on that. So fear of intimacy and things like that, I guess. What other ways would you kind of say that this manifests itself, perhaps without the listener realizing?
Sure, absolutely. So there may sometimes there can be a generalized anxiety. So we don't want to diagnose the entire population as tokophobic, but if you're aware that there's kind of a general anxiety, that you're worrying about a lot of what ifs, you're really focusing on the future, and particularly the things that can go wrong, or the past and the negatives. But birth is part of that. Sometimes it may be an absolute avoidance. That may be what you're picking up in yourself. So an avoidance of even discussions about birth on TV, or even within your family or with your partner, or you always find yourself changing the subject, or you just do not want to be around the whole antenatal pregnancy idea. If you find yourself triggered by a woman pushing a pram down the street, or a woman who's pregnant. So those would be the times that fear is affecting you to seek help.
No, that's really interesting. And I think that, so many people wouldn't even realize that is perhaps what they're subconsciously doing. So I think definitely that's something really important to consider. But I guess moving on to overcoming and counteracting this and the work that you do, would you like to maybe say a little bit about that and the different options and things that, you guys get up to?
Sure, absolutely. It's sometimes how long is a piece of string to how we work. We certainly work on a one-to-one basis, and on a practical form that can actually be in person in our clinic. We're based in Salisbury in Wiltshire, or on a Zoom or Skype option. So we see people all over the UK. We see people all over the world. I mean, again, because we run a specialist service, that's why we tend to attract, if you like, a much wider catchment area. But you can certainly be looking at working with someone even on trauma, because it's not just about birth information that they may have heard or may have experienced. In the case of secondary, there may also be traumas, whether it's medical trauma, whether it is from the past, whether it's bereavement and loss, whether it's a trauma associated with abuse that they may or may not be aware of. So we could find ourselves in our one-to-one work with clients exploring all of these things. Not necessarily, we don't go everywhere, we only go where we need to. But help to education's a big part of what we do. And empowerment is a huge part of what we do. So helping people with decision-making tools so that they feel empowered, if you like, and part of that decision. Helping them see the reality of even the legal situation of their choices and their choices and their kind of legal rights during childbirth and during pregnancy, because a lot of people feel, well, that would be my power and control, if you like, handed over completely. And that is not the case, but sometimes you do need to assert yourself. That sounds super amazing. And I guess, so you guys are a specialist clinic, but is there also that specialist avenue available through services like the NHS? How do you think it's kind of comparable, just for different options that listeners may be thinking about? Yeah, absolutely. So there are some areas, I think it's going to be which geographical area within the UK or of course be
Yeah.
beyond that you're in. Some places have specialist teams, so-called perinatal teams or prenatal teams that actually, so depending on the scope of their work, sometimes the priority or the eligibility may be that you're pregnant already, which I know is counterintuitive to what I've just been saying. But some of them do actually work with women who aren't pregnant or who have suffered birth trauma. So there are a lot of specialist teams that are emerging more and more out there. However, if you're in a general area where you're asking your GP and they put you in touch with the obstetrics or the gynecological services, and they don't have the specialist team, there are still midwives, for example, that you may be able to have a bit of a debrief about previous experiences or just a talk through the reality of what it's about and empowering you to make choices and decisions.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
Yeah, definitely. And how do you find the NHS has been in kind of training the appropriate people and really expanding these teams, as you say, as it affects so many people and likely to be more? How have you kind of found the NHS's response to that?
Sure. Well, our hypnobirthing service, for example, which is a big part of if someone has a fear of childbirth or tokophobia, it's a big part of what we would do with them. Obviously, we wouldn't do a hypnobirthing course with someone unless they're actually pregnant. So that's a little bit different. So what I was going to say is the NHS have for many years now been embracing hypnobirthing. The very big research studies, so that's looking at fear of childbirth as well, have actually been funded and conducted within the NHS. So there is a recognition that this is a big issue. Our service, even as a private service, was part funded right up until 2011, which seems like a long time ago. But unfortunately, they just don't have the extra funds. I mean, we're all aware of, the NHS and those difficult decisions, funding decisions that have got to be made. But having said that, there are a lot more in-house services than there ever were before. So including perinatal and prenatal teams. So it really is just a matter of finding out what is in your catchment area, but they're certainly embracing it. It's just whether the funding is following. So still got a long way to go, but nobody within the NHS or working within maternity services are going to go tokophobia. That's not a real thing. There's certainly an awful lot more awareness, if not the funding behind it.
Oh, that's amazing. That's really nice to hear. And hopefully we can continue moving in the right direction and really expand the services across all locations. Because it just seems unfair that some have teams that can cope with it and some don't. I guess at more of an individual level, what kind of, say, if listeners may feel as if they may be tokophobic, for example, and may want to employ strategies in their day-to-day life, for example, what kind of things would you recommend just on a more individual basis? Perhaps if you're waiting to seek help, or if you're on one of these waiting lists, what kind of things do you recommend?
Yeah. So, first of all, don't avoid talking about these things. I'm not suggesting that you would do something triggering if you are severely tokophobic by going straight into watching birth videos or whatever, because that could trigger a trauma, for example, or re-traumatization. So it's about talking about it, involving the people that are part of your support network. So if you do have a partner, make sure your partner's aware of it, rather than feeling shame as so many women and so many men can actually feel, I can't mention it, they're going to think I'm silly, they're not going to take me seriously, etc. So please, please, please talk to your partner, and also find out how they feel, because part of that reassurance may come from how they're feeling. You may find that they've got fears that they're not talking as well.
Yeah.
Also asked friends and families, so your extended support network, to be sensitive about what's going on, because you might have sisters or cousins who have children and I go, oh, for goodness sake, everybody does it. You've just got to get on with it, that may not have the sensitivity there. So, access some resources out there on reading. I mean, obviously our website has got some information, but there's a wealth of information out there.
I agree with everything you were saying with regards to not being a bit more sensitive in when you speak about it with family members and just about it in general. I think people need to realize that not everyone, there's this expectation to have children, but this is not always the case for everyone and not always the route that people want to take. So I think it's, having that self-awareness. But I think as that kind of times well with drawing to the end of the show. But thank you so much. That was super interesting.
Giving them the courage perhaps to go and seek help.
No, definitely. I think that's super inspiring, and the work that you're doing in the area is super interesting. And we encourage any listeners to get in touch if they feel affected by any of these issues. And I think that will be the end of our podcast for this week. But thank you so much, Sharon, and I hope you have a lovely week.